Ethics is the attempt to answer the question, how do we live? And today, in our current context, we have a lot of issues with how we ought to live as a society. We seem to be in a chaotic world with people who do things that cause a sense of outrage, moral outrage in the rest of us. We seem to have a very well-developed sense of what should not be the case, what shouldn't happen. However, the problem that we have in society today is that we very rarely, as a whole, have any kind of idea of where goodness comes from and what we should do, what we ought to do. We get upset when things that should be a certain way are not that way, but then we can't actually articulate what should be. So there are two basic ways of looking at ethics. There is an objective angle, which is where you ask the question, where does goodness come from, and what kind of person should I be? And then there's a subjective question or angle for ethics, which is the attempt to express what we feel we should do, or what we personally would like to be, or who we would personally like to be. And I think our society today is having a difficult time with whether ethics is subjective or if it's objective. Does it come from the self? Is it determined by the self? Or does it come from outside of the self and from something greater or even someone greater? And most people seem to wish or operate as though there was an ethical standard apart from themselves, but rarely do they have any idea where that would come from or who that would come from. And when you don't know the source of an ethical standard, then you have a tendency to not be very motivated to follow it. So what happens is a lot of people, because they don't know where any kind of objective ethical standard would come from, they default to doing what they feel like doing what they personally want to do, expressing themselves. So valuing my feelings, my outrage, my identity over anything else. So what matters for me is what is primarily most important. But the problem with that approach is that we can't really know what is best for me, what's best for the self, if I don't even really know what kind of being I am in the first place. Christian ethics gives us a much greater answer to this, a lot more stability ethically than just grasping at straws ethically, which is what the rest of society tends to do. And this is because Christianity answers the big questions. It answers the question, first of all, what kind of beings are we? It also answers the question, where does morality come from? And who says that we should follow it? Well, it comes from God. God says that we should follow it. And I'll get into more detail there in a little bit. But what kind of beings we are is really important, because what we need in order to flourish, in order to do well, in order to live a good life, be ethical, that requires understanding that we are the sorts of beings that are made to be moral. We are made in the image and likeness of God, which means that we are creative, we are relational, we are meant to care about justice, we're meant to love each other, we're rational, we're relational, we're emotional. So we're all these things that we need to take into account when we are trying to figure out what is the best life for a human being. And Christian ethics gives us the ability to recognize why ethics matters, why being a good person matters. It has to do with character. And when we're worried about our character, sometimes people will say things like, well, that's your values. Your values are what determine your character. But the problem with that is that it's subjective. What I value is purely what I'm interested in, what I want to value, what my personality is like, that kind of thing. But what we really should be focused on as Christians is virtues. So instead of asking, what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of person do I feel like being? Instead, we should ask the question, what is the right kind of person, period? And in light of that, what kind of person should I be regardless of how I feel about it? Regardless of my leanings, my personality, my vices, my laziness, my short-sightedness, anything like that. So when we care about justice, it needs to be real justice. We need to care about people, even people who we wouldn't necessarily naturally care about. We need to love people who haven't necessarily done anything for us to help us. We need to give grace to people who have not given us grace. Why? Because God gave us grace first. We forgive likewise because God first forgave us. We love because God first loved us. It doesn't have to do with what we feel like doing. It has everything to do with an obedient, thankful response to what God first did for us.